In this news roundup of a week, the 27th of January 2023. Ukraine is rocked by serious revelations of corruption as the West finally organises to send it tanks. The SNP's gender recognition bill blows up in its face as it backs down on sending a rapist to a women's prison. Switzerland could soon be undertaking a highly symbolic referendum on net zero policies. And in this week's Short Thought, I talk about how every time you feel as though you might be about to feel offended, it's actually a great opportunity. My name's Mallen Baker, this is the Mallen Baker Show. This week saw high-profile commentary on corruption in Ukraine and actions being taken by President Zelensky to tackle it. Nearly a dozen ministers and officials lost their jobs following a series of scandals involving people at the Defence Ministry as well as prominent members of Zelensky's own team. For instance, the highest profile casualty was Krylo Tymoshenko, the deputy head of Zelensky's presidential office. Tymoshenko handed in his resignation, but no specific reason so far was given. But he had been accused of misusing foreign aid by a Ukrainian media outlet that noted he was driving an SUV that had been donated by General Motors for use in humanitarian evacuations, and that's when he wasn't seen driving a $100,000 Porsche. Also out the door was Deputy Defence Minister Vyacheslav Shapovalov. Ukrainian media had published a purchasing contract showing that his office was paying massively above the market price for basic foods for the army. These sorts of schemes tend to involve collaborations with food suppliers and the individuals concerned creaming off the surplus that's being paid above the standard price. Another Deputy Minister, Vasyl Lozinski, was arrested by the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, allegedly for accepting a $400,000 bribe for fixing a contract on inflated terms. As you can imagine, this sort of process is considered highly delicate because Ukraine wants to get the balance right between being seen to act and address such corruption to reassure Western donors and not wanting to talk about corruption happening at all so as not to put off Western donors. Hence the focus of the small number of mainstream articles on the events being on Zelensky taking robust action. It's a framing that makes them feel they can discuss what's happening without necessarily handing a huge propaganda win to Vladimir Putin. Indeed, Politico ran a piece talking about the dilemma facing Ukrainian journalists who broke some of those stories, facing the challenge of reporting about something that has the potential to undermine your country in a time of war. Because as we know, different rules do apply during actual wartime. You're engaged in a life and death struggle. But also, that's exactly the situation that those interested in serving themselves at the expense of their country can often act with the least amount of scrutiny. So, if you accept those different rules apply in wartime, and they certainly did for our countries in the Second World War, then what is the patriotic thing to do? Where is the line to be drawn? The journalist who got the scoop on the inflated military contract said that he'd done everything he could not to publish his findings, taking them first to public officials, hoping that they would be able to take action. When in the end they didn't, for whatever reason, he finally felt that they had to run it on the zn.ua website. Obviously, in Russia, the choice is clear. Journalists cannot criticise the leadership, end of story. Not unless they leave the country and do it from somewhere else. But in Ukraine, the country on whose territory the war is being fought, it's a more difficult dilemma. In the first 6 months of the invasion, Politico said, Ukrainian journalists and watchdogs agreed to put their routine public criticism of the government on pause because, there were actual Russian war crimes to report on. But that, it seems, backfired. In a column for Ukrainska Pravda, Mikhailo Tkach admitted this pause led to a rapid loss of accountability for many Ukrainian officials. Tkach uncovered the fact that Ukrainian officials were leaving the country during the war for lavish European holidays, thanks to the work-related exemptions from travel bans for civil servants. The reporting led Zelensky to impose a ban on officials travelling abroad for non-work purposes and to the sacking of the Deputy Prosecutor General. So, would this action by Zelensky have been happening at all if certain Ukrainian journalists hadn't decided that they should put a spotlight on it? And you've got to say, probably not. But the fact that they did, and the government had to quickly respond, should at least be taken as a good sign in terms of the nature of the regime and the hopes for it in the future. Even in a time of war, the response to such stories was to hunt down the corrupt officials, not the journalists who exposed them. For now, Ukraine's allies are as keen as they are themselves to prevent this sort of thing from derailing unity. Zelensky's actions were praised, for instance, by the European Commission. They will be aware that any country in Ukraine's situation will have more such problems lurking in all the quiet corners. But for now, it seems that Zelensky passed the test. Such assessments will go easy for him so long as the war lasts, probably no longer than that. After all, before the war started, Transparency International had ranked Ukraine as the second most corrupt country in Europe, behind Russia. Cleaning that up, which will be essential if Ukraine's to join the EU one day as it hopes, will take a lot more effort and will necessarily get extremely messy. Mind you, of course, that was before the European Parliament turned out to be such a hotbed of corruption itself, especially in relation to, allegedly, Qatar. I don't suppose the scandal pushed the EU down the scale by a huge amount, but it would be awkward timing for Eurocrats to be pointing fingers too vigorously elsewhere. According to reports, attempts to reform the European Parliament to avoid such corruption in the future seem likely to be rejected. So, always easy to focus on what the other people do. In the meantime, none of that has stopped the Western nations finally breaking the logjam that I discussed last week to agree to send tanks to Ukraine. Lots of them. Olaf Scholz caved to pressure and agreed to send Leopard 2 tanks and to allow other countries, such as Poland, to do the same. They could move quite quickly, as can the British Challenger 2 tanks that are on their way. And that's seen as being significant because they could be in place potentially in time for the expected spring offensive by the Russians. American Abrams tanks will probably take longer to deliver. But Germany wanted not to be isolated as the main donor of tanks, and the American pledge has given them that cover. Arguably, the exact timing of when they get delivered is less important. As I said last week, I remain curious to know exactly how much difference those donations are really expected to make in the battlefield, but now I guess we get to find out. Speaking of battlefields, Scottish politics is an interesting place right now. The drama between the UK government and Scotland over gender self-ID took a turn sharply against Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon this week. You'll recall that last week I showed footage of the debate in Parliament where one MP, who had highlighted the risks to women and children from the proposed self-ID laws, was harangued and abused as disgusting by one MP for equating trans people with abusers, in his view.
The idea of linking trans people with predators, frankly, is disgusting, and you should be ashamed.
In one of those accidents of timing that can smack you right in the face, the news became focused this week on the case of a man who raped 2 women and then decided to identify as a woman after being charged, and is currently being held at Cornton Vale Women's Jail. This was taking advantage of the Scottish legal system's already liberal system, not even benefiting from the rights that the new legislation would have provided, because had the new bill been law, there is no doubt this individual would have been legally classified as a woman under it. As we discuss this today, he remains legally a man. This is the case of Adam Graham, described in most news stories as Isla Bryson, his chosen female name. And let me explain something before continuing. I will respect individuals by calling them their chosen names and all of that, except if you're a man who has raped women and you're suddenly coming out as a woman so that you can get access to more women in the prison system. That is just a charade. I don't believe in dignifying that with any modicum of complicity. MPs who are foaming at the mouth at the equation of the vast majority of trans people with predators should be making clear to draw the distinction between those who are predators and the rest. Otherwise, it's you who are blurring the boundaries between them, not those who are saying that individuals like Adam Graham should not be sent to women's prisons. That seems so completely obvious and common sense, it just beggars belief that you even have to say it. But That was the rock that Nicola Sturgeon chose to lash herself onto. Having picked a fight with Westminster over the new law when it decided to then veto it, she suddenly found herself forced to defend the sending of this abusive and violent man to a woman's prison. In the Scottish Parliament, Sturgeon had to reassure the public that, of course, this double rapist wouldn't be spending his, sentence in a woman's prison. She was then asked, not unreasonably, so where is this person located right now, at this very minute? Surprisingly, by which I mean not surprisingly at all, she seemed to dodge the question. It took 4 attempts before she finally admitted he was currently in a women's prison, albeit in the segregation unit. This was after a number of voices had been raised against the case, such as Sandy Brindley, the chief executive of Rape Crisis Scotland, who said, "I don't see how it is possible to have a rapist within a female prison." Why does that even need to be said, you might ask? Indeed, a former governor of the women's prison in question, Rona Hotchkiss, told BBC Scotland that she would have resigned as governor before letting this prisoner into that prison. She pointed out that putting him in segregation could only be a temporary thing because the rules are you can only do that for 72 hours, and that's something you wouldn't need to do at all if you'd sent them to a men's prison. The court that sentenced Graham specified that he should be sent to a men's prison. But the opinion of the court is not binding on the Scottish prison system. You might be asking yourself, so how come the Scottish prison system is so progressive in this sense? Not by accident, is the answer. The Telegraph reported that the prison service had specifically been targeted for years by trans rights activists who believed that if they could get gender recognition policies there, then that would be the entry point that would persuade other public bodies that they had to follow suit. James Morton, who was formerly the director of a trans lobby group, wrote in a 2018 book the following. We strategised that by working intensively with the Scottish Prison Service to support them to include trans women as women on a self-declaration basis within very challenging circumstances, we would be able to ensure that all other public services should be able to do likewise. The point, of course, of doing such a thing on a self-declaration basis is that you remove the decision-making from any sort of sensible risk analysis or even basic reality check. Prison chiefs have said that while you might try to bring other factors into play, disregarding a legal gender recognition certificate could well leave them exposed to legal challenge. But ideologically driven campaigners are focused on their political objectives, not the safety of women in prison or indeed anywhere else. It's also emerged that while awaiting trial for the charges of rape, Graham joined a beauty course as a transgender woman. Other students on the course were asked to strip off for beauty classes on spray tanning that he was attending, completely unaware that they had a sex offender sitting right there watching them. Graham was eventually thrown off the course for being repeatedly overpowering and disruptive, verbally attacking other students and reducing several teachers to tears. This was a grown-up place where we can have such discussions. You could point to individuals like this and work out how one gives people the respect they should have while not opening the door to people like that. You would think we could agree that was the exam question. The answers to that question might well differ. People will have very different opinions. They'll believe in very strongly, but at least agree that's the problem you're trying to solve. But apparently it's easier to shout down anyone who makes this point, label them as a TERF or whatever, rather than to actually have a discussion about real outcomes on real people. Other groups are now starting to speak up about this outside the normal spectrum involved in the debate. So 1,400 church leaders wrote to the Prime Minister this week, warning that the UK government's proposed bill on conversion therapy, which we discussed last week, has been extended to include gender, would likely criminalise churches as well as parents and teachers. And they said this: if the government gives in to activist demands, it appears almost certain that innocent Christians will be criminalised. Indeed, this seems to be the goal of at least some of those most eager for a new law. And they went on to add this: "We trust you are well aware of the harm being caused to children by the inappropriate promotion of questionable ideologies. Children are left confused about what it means to be male or female, what constitutes appropriate sexual behaviour, and the basic question of who they are." This is the Church of England saying this, not a rabid band of mutant TERFs or whatever people think is involved. How this plays out is still an open question in general, but for Nicola Sturgeon, there could hardly have been a more disastrous full stop to her argument with the UK government about gender self-ID. Elsewhere, other struggles are taking attention. So, for instance, will Switzerland decide to sign up to a net zero target by 2050? The uber-democratic and mostly neutral nation is gearing up to another battle on the topic, as the Swiss People's Party, a member of the ruling coalition, is aiming to call a referendum. Specifically, it's aiming to block a draft law that would commit to making Switzerland carbon neutral by 2050. The bill would accelerate emissions cuts with a rollout of renewables, particularly solar power, with an additional $2.2 billion worth of funding. Nuclear power is not included in the proposal, so at the moment Switzerland gets as much as 40% of its power from nuclear, but in an echo of Germany's progress to date. In 2011, its parliament decided not to replace any of those reactors, a decision that was confirmed in 2017 with a referendum. There are moves afoot to seek to reverse that, with a group of politicians leading a Stop Blackouts campaign to keep nuclear as part of the mix. A poll taken just before the Russian invasion of Ukraine saw the population split nearly 50-50 on whether that ban should be reversed, with the narrowest of margins being in favour of new nuclear being permitted. As for this latest move, even if the SVP were unsuccessful, the new draft bill would in any case need to be approved again in a referendum. In fact, it's a watered-down version of a bill that was rejected by popular vote 2 years ago. It was a narrow rejection, 51% to 49%, but a rejection nonetheless. In that case, the bill included policies such as vehicle fuel tax and a flight tax. Voters were then worried about the impact on the economy as it was moving towards post-COVID recovery. And of course, while some in the UK argue that Britain is only responsible for 2% of global emissions, opponents in Switzerland were able to point to the fact the nation of 9 million people contributed just 0.1% of those emissions. The new bill might well be watered down from the one that failed by just 1%. That doesn't mean it will go through, because then the concerns with the cost of living, well, they're likely to be even higher now, not lower. So you'd have to be a courageous betting man to put a lot of money on that outcome. Now you might well say, well, so what? Surely it doesn't matter. It's just a small country, but it is an interesting bellwether. Switzerland has two distinctive features. One, it's traditionally prided itself on its environmental credentials, and two, with its tradition of frequent referenda, it's one of those that's more committed to direct democracy. If the population of Switzerland, by however narrow a margin, turns against the same sort of proposals that a significant number of European countries are currently putting in place, it shows the real potential for those measures to lose popular support in ways they don't anticipate. That's why the 2021 vote was considered such a shock. One reason why a lot of people will be looking with keen interest at what this highly distinctive nation ends up deciding to do. I've always believed that you should be diplomatic with people, but tell them the truth. Assuming it matters, of course, because sometimes it's just not your place to offer an opinion at all. Something a few people on Twitter could do with considering, but I digress. I noted Piers Morgan this week, saying that being told by a critic, rather rudely as it happened, that he was fat had actually been highly motivating for him in deciding to lose weight. And of course he was using this as a justification for him being rude about other people, which of course is his style. Not everybody has a thicker skin as Piers Morgan, of course, so I would tend to advise against attacking people in that way, since rarely is it as productive a strategy as it was for him. But yes, for those who should be expressing an opinion, tell the truth. And when people do it to you, don't waste time being offended. even if they take the Piers Morgan approach rather than the Mallen Baker approach. Instead, evaluate the feedback. I mean, it may well be completely wrong, but it may be something that you can benefit from hearing and then acting on. Being fat is sort of in a league of its own, of course. If you're fat, you're unhealthy. You're at higher risk from many, many diseases. People who preach body positivity and all body types are just as good, they are not doing you a favour. If you want to be healthy, that is, and you want to live longer, of course, lose weight. I gained weight once in my life. If I'd listened to the people around me who were trying to be kind, I would have accepted this was a normal part of getting older and I would have let it happen. That would not have taken me to a good place for all that they meant well. It doesn't mean you should just go around yelling at fat people, telling them what they already know. But if you're a doctor or a good friend, then yes, you should be telling them. But what about those things you can't do anything about? Should you be offended if someone says, for instance, you're ugly, or they think you're stupid, or whatever it might be? Well, you can choose to be offended if you wish, but it's not productive. The fact that person has a negative perception of you is just interesting feedback. It may or may not be related to the thing they actually spoke about. And the fact they're the sort of person who would choose deliberately to be hurtful probably means they're the sort of person you should be perfectly happy to piss off. Certainly not giving them power over you by taking the words they've said to heart. But the point is this: we all get some strengths and weaknesses in life. Some of us have movie star good looks, some of us don't. It gives you an advantage in some areas, so if you don't, you have to have a strategy to minimise the weaknesses and maximise the things that you do have. Some people have great intellect or amazing charisma. Some are very driven and ambitious, leading them to become highly respected and accomplished. Again, those things give you an advantage in some areas that can help offset weaknesses in others. On the flip side, some of those with one or more of those advantages, they kind of make up for it by having huge personality flaws or chronic behaviour traits that make people actively dislike them. Hence why some of the people who we all thought had it all end up actually doing things like committing suicide or engaging in self-destructive behaviour, because it's not how it felt to them. You can change such things, but not easily, and not at all if you don't notice that you have them. This is the added layer to the self-awareness I was talking about last week, being open to the cues and clues about how you succeed and fail in making the impression that you want to make in the world. Noticing the impact you make with honesty and clarity, and thinking about it in a problem-solving way, rather than a self-judgmental kind of a way. You define yourself not by the things you inherited by an accident of birth, but by your actions and attitudes, the obstacles you overcome, the mistakes you learn from, the things that you do. Other people's opinions don't define you, but they can be useful input as to things you can improve to overcome some of those obstacles. Treat it as neutral feedback, to be evaluated and accepted or rejected, rather than something that goes deep to the heart of who you are, and you need never waste time being offended ever again. Alright, I'm expecting that the video that I've discussed on the COVID vaccines and myocarditis will drop next week. Time has been a tight resource so far in 2023, so it's taken a while. Plus, there's an awful lot of research studies in that particular topic. Let me thank, as always, the people who support this channel on Patreon. I could not produce these videos without that support. If you would like to add yours for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. As you know, it is always appreciated and it is very much needed. Either way, have a great week. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.